Does John chapter 20 verse 28 prove that Jesus is God? So let's take a look at this. The verse in question is John chapter 20 verse 28, where Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God," after Jesus' alleged resurrection. So the Greek words that are used, and we're going to be focusing on this video, are the Greek word is Kurios and Theos, God and God or God, with a broader meaning than is customary today. So let's take a look at those Greek words right now. We see that the Greek words Theos and Kurios are used throughout the New Testament for other figures besides, other human and supernatural figures besides Jesus. For example, the Roman governor in Acts chapter 12 verse 22, and even the devil in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 4 were called God or gods using the same Greek word Theos. It was used of someone with divine authority. It was not limited to its absolute sense as a personal name for the supreme deity we use it today. So notice how the Roman governor and even the devil were called God or gods using the same Greek word theos as was used in the Gospel of John, or used the doubting Thomas face. It was used for someone with divine authority. That doesn't mean that they're God, or like in what we think of the supreme God, or God the Father, using Christian terms. Secondly, all throughout the New Testament and the Gospel of John, the overwhelming usage of God is in the reference to the Father, and the Lord is in reference to Jesus. We see this in John chapter 1 verse 18, John chapter 3 verse 16, John chapter 6 verse 68, John chapter 13 verse 14, John chapter 17 verse 3, John chapter 20 verse 18, John chapter 21 verse 12, Ephesians chapter 1 verse 17, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 3, Acts chapter 2 verse 36, etc., etc. So so notice how God is in reference to the Father and Lord. So God and Lord are separate. So why would we understand those phrases differently here? For example, even in this context, God distinguished from Jesus, and Jesus has a God. If we read John chapter 20 verse 17, Jesus has a God. Jesus says, I'm going on to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God. So according to John chapter 20 verse 17, God, or Jesus, has a God. So that means that Jesus cannot be God or equal to God, since Jesus himself has a God. Again, John chapter 20 verse 17, John chapter 17 verse 3, Jesus says the Father is the only true God, and God is sent. So Jesus is separate from God, according to the Gospel of John chapter 17 verse 3. But moving on, how would God have a God? How would God, Jesus, have a God, the Father, if there's only one God? So how can Jesus be a God if he has a God? We read in Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one." Isaiah chapter 44 verse 6, John chapter 17 verse 3, there is only one God. So it would be rather strange for us to confuse God and Jesus here in John chapter 20 verse 28, making them one and the same. So notice how God and Jesus are separated in John chapter 17 verse 3. So what that means is that God and Jesus are not equal, or they're not the same, given other verses in the Gospel of John. Like the Gospel of John chapter 20 verse 17, Gospel of John chapter 17 verse 3, and again, there's only one God, according to the Old Testament and New Testament. So what that means is that Jesus is not equal to God according to other places in the New Testament. So we have to harmonize that with the Gospel of John chapter 20 verse 28. Otherwise, you have a serious contradiction. So the conclusion here is, in the context of John chapter 17 verse 3, John chapter 20 verse 17, Acts chapter 12 verse 22, etc., Jesus has a God. So if Jesus has a God, he cannot be equal to God or of the same essence as God. The Greek word used is theos, used in John chapter 20, verse 28, and it is referring to Jesus as having divine authority, not Jesus being equal to God or being the same as God. Um, so, like, for example, we see that the Roman governor in Acts chapter 12, verse 22 is seen as a god. Satan is called a god in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. So that Greek word does not mean someone is God, but rather has divine authority.